Good afternoon and welcome to the 7th in IWM's Hindsight in 2020 series. This is a series of online conversations where we examine modern war and conflict, drawing on insight from experts and using history as a means by which we examine the present by understanding better the past. So far, we've looked at coronavirus and its impact on refugees, on the relationship between the US and China, looked at terrorism, and today we're going to be examining history itself, looking at how we remember things, and our conversation is going to be entitled Legacies of Empire, How Should We Memorialise Our Past? We're going to speak for about 30 minutes and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A, and for those of you who've joined us, please use the Ask a Question box at the bottom of the screen. That will send a question to me and then I will be able to put as many as I can to the audience. My name is Suzanne Rain and I'm a trustee at the Imperial War Museum. What we remember has always been controversial. What we memorialise has always been controversial. When IWM was founded in 1917, the intention of the man whose idea it was, a Liberal MP called Sir Alfred Mond, was not that it should be a collection of relics, but that it should reflect people's personal experience of the First World War. And during the opening ceremony, he said, "It was hoped to make the museum so complete that everyone who took part in the war, however obscurely, would find therein an example or illustration of the sacrifice he or she made, and that the museum was not a monument to military glory, but a record of toil and sacrifice." Even despite that, there were some who felt that putting up a museum would perpetuate an undesirable war spirit. And one MP said he would refuse to vote a penny of public money to commemorate such suicidal madness of civilization as that which was shown in the late war. And those of you who were lucky enough to get to IWM North's exhibition in Manchester 2 years ago, that it was called Lest We Forget. And the purpose of the exhibition was to look at how remembrance is represented in popular culture and how forms of state remembrance have evolved. And one of the things I found very powerful was a representation of the debate that was held in 1919 about whether to spend money putting up war memorials in towns and villages across the UK to the people who had died, or whether to give the money to the widows and families of the people who'd been killed. And of course, now when we go and stand at those war memorials, wherever they are in our villages and towns, we have that experience, but we don't know about the debate about whether the money should be spent putting them up in the first place. This summer, of course, among everything else, this question about what we memorialise has been brought to the fore again with a very sort of heated debate, strong feelings all round, and probably sort of the pinnacle of which in the UK was the pulling down of the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston in Bristol. We're going to come on to a discussion about statues, but the aim of this discussion is to have a sort of bigger and deeper conversation about how we remember history, what history we choose to remember, particularly when those people who actually remember aren't around anymore to guide us. What is the proper role for monuments and museums and cultural and educational establishments in helping us to reflect and remember? So as you can see, I'm joined by a fantastic panel to help us talk us through this. Patrick Vernon is a cultural historian, campaigner and social commentator who's very well known for his work in tackling race inequality in the UK. Dr. Meera Sabaratnam is Senior Lecturer in International Relations at SOAS, and she's Chair of the Decolonising SOAS Working Group. And Tom Holland is a historian who's published a number of best-selling books, including works on classical history, medieval history, and histories of Christendom and Islam. And his latest book, Dominion, is issued this month in paperback. So welcome to you all and welcome to our audience. So we're going to rattle through this massive subject as eloquently as we can. Mira, I'm going to start with you. What do you think the role of museums, monuments, educational, social establishments should be when it comes to remembering the past?
Well, thank you, Suzanne. Thanks, everyone. So, put broadly, I think these institutions should help us be our best selves. What do I mean by that? I mean that they should be helping us be truthful about the past, be appreciative of what's happened, as you say, things like sacrifice and suffering. They should be balanced, they should engage with the public, and they should allow us to see how our pasts connect with our present. So how large processes or events, or even small ones, smaller scale social histories, lead to the kinds of environments in which we live in now. I saw a talk by Professor Gus John in which he talked about education as humanization. And I think that's the great potentiality of all of these institutions. Now, what we struggle with, or the dilemma facing a number of these institutions now, is how to conduct humanization when people have such varied experiences of it and have been, if you like, winners and losers, or included and excluded in those stories. But I think the great promise that we have and the opportunity that we have is to make those cultural institutions a space for where those things can be negotiated in a democratic, rigorous, intellectual, and transformative way.
Thank you. That's a great way to start. So building on that, Patrick, and so you can answer a bit of that question, but I want to keep adding questions in. Is any attempt to remember the past a political act? So is it possible to tell a story which honours sacrifices and personal contribution and celebrates values without having a political angle to it?
I mean, in reality, it's all about politics, because anything around war and conflict is about politics. And we like to give the impression, particularly with lots of cultural institutions, that it's a very objective, neutral perspective. But when you start to raise issues about, well, actually, what about the other side of the story? Then it's either seen as politically correct or incorrect, depending where you're at. And therefore, you have a one-sided version. So, I mean, I use the kind of phrase, most of the cultural institutions in Britain still portray Britain as a cross between EastEnders and Brideshead Revisited. It's very narrow-minded, not inclusive enough. It's only been the last 20, 30 years. There has been, through campaigning, lobbying, which I've been involved in, and many people have been involved in, challenging institutions to say, your narrative of Britain, your narrative of this war or this conflict or this situation is one-sided, it's misleading, or at worst, condescending. And it's how we have an inclusive approach to that. That's why it's a vexed subject, because when you talk about someone like Colston, the Colston statue, or any memorial, which people defend vigorously because it says you can't change history. And we're not saying that you can't change history, but let's have a history that reflects the whole totality, not a narrow perspective. And that's part of the challenge, which becomes politics. It depends on your worldview, how you see conflict, how you see memorialisation.
Yeah. And that's particularly true with some of the modern conflicts that we've got, which are, much less clear cut even than perhaps some of the bigger conflicts in the past. So, Tom, do you think that museums, cultural, educational sectors should distinguish between good and bad history? So, taking what Patrick said there, you have people with very different views about the history that there is. How do you make that distinction without being drawn into political judgments? Or should you make that distinction?
I think that every museum, in a way, when it's trying to decide how to present history, has to look in the mirror and recognise that the very idea of a museum is itself deeply rooted in distinct cultural assumptions and prejudices. So the modern museum as it exists in Britain is pretty clearly a product of the Enlightenment, and it reflects both an era where Europe is becoming more self-confident, where it, if you like, is starting to accumulate the kind of loot from across the globe that would enable the Enlightenment ideal of a universalist exhibition space to come alive. Now, you can cast that in a very negative sense as being just a repository of loot, or you can cast it in a more positive sense, as Neil MacGregor did in his kind of brilliant rebranding of the British Museum as a museum of the world for the world. But that, just to say that it's enlightenment, again, look at where the origin of these collections come from. They're kind of cabinets of curiosity. So the foundation of the Ashmolean is a great kind of collection, which in turn is gathered together as a result of curiosity. So the curiosity is simultaneously something that can be an expression of power and an expression of respect. And I think that it's how you kind of integrate those two dimensions that museums have to face if they're going to ask themselves, well, what kind of presentation of history are we going to give?
So Mira, that's a lovely way to put it. If a museum or the selection of what we are memorializing is an expression of either power or respect or somewhere in between. I think there's probably some other stuff as well about sort of sentiment, I suppose. But what is the role of the curator in the broadest sense? This comes to the heart of, who decides what goes in? Does it end up with one person choosing, a collector chooses the collection? For example, in the IWM, it acquires things, but it also very much relies on people donating things. Who makes the decisions? Or who should?
So I think these are really critical questions. And just to touch on something that Tom was saying about the relationship between curiosity, power, and respect. A lot of the critique that's been made of museums from a broadly sort of decolonizing angle is that people aren't just curiosities, they're people, right? They don't deserve to just be objectified and spoken for, but they have the right to speak back, to express ownership over objects or over practices that they hold dear to them. So I think what we're shifting from is that idea that the authoritative figure of the museum creator can just put everybody in his collector's case and speak for them. We're moving towards a more democratic idea of the museum, where actually we say there are multiple subjects here, each with a stake in what's being represented and how it's being represented. And curatorship, I think, is actually currently evolving towards being a more democratic kind of process. So it's not just one person telling what they think is the story or the story of a narrow group of people. We've got to start thinking about how can we take what we love, which is the humanizing process of seeing things and understanding people from other cultures and histories and so on. How can we make that more, not just respectful, but more democratic, not just in terms of the space, but in the processes through which those spaces are curated?
Patrick, do you want to pick up on that? So how do we ensure that the museums feel represented? How do you make that bridge essentially between the curators or the collectors and the people?
It's a good question. It's a question that's been grappled by the sector for a number of decades. I can remember about 10, 15 years ago being on a GLA commission on African Asian heritage, where we looked at the very same question about the role of museums, archives, and funding around heritage in London, which obviously had national implications because we've got all the nationals in London. There were lots of sessions where museum directors on their best foot shared their stories, how they were changing on the interpretation of objects, how they were going to create more BME representation in museum staff and diversity on their boards and etc. But 10, 15 years on, what has changed? There have been some improvements, but how many Black and multi-ethnic curators are there in Britain? How many chief execs or senior directors are there in the museum sector? And that's a question we need to ask ourselves, because it's all about power. And it's all very well to invite someone like myself or someone from on the fringes to say, what's your view on our objects, or let's have a community engagement event. It's all very nice, but ultimately it's down to the organisation and the senior leadership to decide, and the trustees to decide what is in and what's out. So it's about, and that's why the whole stuff around Black Lives Matter has been a real important chance to start to reflect on that, because now all of a sudden every single cultural institution in Britain, including the Bank of England and Lloyd's of London, are now issuing statements on Black Lives Matter. So, which is great, and that's nice, and but the proof in the pudding is about how you change from us being subject and objects to us working in partnership around co-production. One of the recommendations from the GLA report was a shared understanding and equitable approaches. So how do you work with people who are outside the sector? Because to be a curator is still a very elitist, exclusive role. I mean, basically, you have to rely on the bank of mum, dad, and everybody else to be a curator. It's not inclusive in terms of, if you're from a working-class background, how do you become a curator? If you're from a minority background, how do you go for that path of being a curator? Because, and so it's about those pathways and having more representation on boards. And without that, then we'll just look at stuff in the margins.
And I know IWM's looking at all sorts of ways to do apprenticeship schemes and things like that, particularly to sort of reach out into the local community in London, because I think recognising exactly what you say, how difficult it is to sort of really embrace a broader sort of selection of the population. Tom, coming on to you, there's a lot has been said over the course of the debate in the summer about rewriting history or photoshopping history. So what is the difference between addressing an imbalance and rewriting history? So, if, for example, if statues are created to if statues are erected to create a historical narrative, if they're taken down, is that also an attempt to create a historical narrative? And what are your thoughts on that issue?
Well, again, as with museums, the fact that our cities are full of statues of people representing people who actually lived, again, this is not in any way a given. This is not something that has happened in cities across the world through all periods of time. For instance, it didn't happen in English towns in the Middle Ages. The sudden appearance of statues representing people is really a product of the rediscovery of ancient Rome. And really, when we're talking about statues, we're talking about a tradition that goes back to the heyday of the empire, and in particular to the emergence of Augustus as the first emperor. And again, it draws on Greek and Roman traditions that you put up a statue of a great man, and it was invariably a great man, although not always. There were statues of Cleopatra, for instance, as well, to memorialize their achievements. And so immediately you have all kinds of connotations that cling to the presence of statues in British cities, which is why if you look at statues from the 17th and early 18th century, you'll often see that English kings or whatever are dressed up as Roman emperors, looking kind of, with their, there's some wonderful ones where they've got kind of Georgian wigs and togas, kind of most unfortunate ensemble. So in a sense, to say what statues should we have, are these statues acceptable or are these statues not, is I think to kind of ignore the broader context, which is to say, well, what does the very fact that we have these kind of statues in our cities saying about our cultural presumptions, and what kind of engagement might we want to have with those cultural assumptions?
So that's a really interesting question, actually, which that's sort of, do we need statues at all? You could argue that we have a celebrity culture, and we've had it for a while, so we'll stick up a statue of quite a lot of people. There are other societies, in very devout forms of Islam, nobody is worthy of a statue because nobody is perfect apart from God, which is another way of looking at it. Patrick, do we need statues at all?
Interesting, this whole subject around statues. Sometimes I think it's like diversion. We've got so het up about statues, and reality is, majority of statues in Britain have been funded by public subscription. So someone said, "Oh, I like this person. He's my hero. I'm going to raise money and have a statue because I think he's great." Or it might be a benefit of someone who's powerful and they want to have a statue to reflect their power, their wealth, their esteem, and etc. etc. And so we've had these statues, around Britain. And if we were to adopt the Equality Act, I would say probably about 90% of those statues probably have to get rid of. But in reality, we'll probably spend the next 20 years getting all these statues. So that's not practical. What's more practical is how we look at some of these statues, and the juxtaposition between Colston and, say, Winston Churchill and others, and even Gandhi and others. A whole debate around those. I don't think we should. I think we should be spending our time getting rid of statues. I know some people, activists, said we should get rid of them because it's about a political statement. But I think certain statues we need to keep, and we have an object, and to reinterpret that history of that individual and what is their true legacy. But I personally believe there are certain statues that do need to get rid of. And from my perspective, any statue that celebrates people who made money out of the transatlantic slave trade need to get rid of. That's my personal opinion. And for the simple reason is you have to compare Germany. So as you know, after the Second World War, when Germany had to pay reparations to Europe, and as Germany as a new nation state, post-Hitler, post-fascism, one of the first things they did was to get rid of any statue that was linked to fascism, and instead focus on the Holocaust, focus on the real history of Germany. And in Britain, we've not done that. We've not had a frank. We've had lots of conversations about issues around that, but not one which, as a nation state, to say, is it right in the 21st century to celebrate people who made money out of the transatlantic slave trade and the atrocities of that trade? I see that as our Holocaust. And if there was a statue of Hitler or someone connected with the Third Reich in Britain, people would say, no way, we'll never have a statue of that nature because of that. But for some reason, we have this argument about the niceties of that statue's all right, or we're rewriting history, when it's a clear act of moving on. It's all about a wider process of reconciliation. And we've never had that. Now, I think if we had plantations in Northumberland, in Cornwall, in Somerset, in the West Midlands and in London, then I think we'd have a different conversation. That's the conversation that's taking place in America. But because we have this cultural amnesia, we don't have that. The conversation is muted, and therefore, when you raise these issues, you are seen as being rewriting history or being politically correct, etc., etc. But we need to have that if we want to move on as a nation.
Thank you. So, Mira, we've come on to statues. So, your view on the rights and wrongs of Edward Colston would be a nice place to start. But could you then build on that? So there is an argument that this is all very well, but we're focusing so much energy on this that we're missing really important stuff that's happening today. So these, people are trafficked today. There's modern slavery now. It's awful stuff is happening in Syria, in China. Are we making a noise about the wrong thing, and are we missing an opportunity to actually apply the messages that are coming from the statues?
Yeah, I think these are really good questions. I mean, on the Colston statue, I gave a radio interview about this last year in which I said it's been clear from the discussions that have been ongoing in Bristol over the last few years that people don't want necessarily to celebrate Colston in the way that the late 19th century people who put him up did. And that process was supposed to be going through the city council, and it was held up by a society which was more supportive of Colston. And so in a way, I think had that democratic process actually just been executed properly, the statue might have been recontextualized or rehomed in a different kind of way. As it was, the thing got thrown in the river. So I can see where that comes from. I would have much preferred, of course, for it to be worked out in a sort of dialogic way. But of course, dialogue has its limits, as we know, in politics and in situations of confrontation. Going on to the question of whether we're focusing on the wrong thing, though, I mean, yes and no. Right. Yes, absolutely. The structural issues to do with inequalities in this country, particularly as they relate to Britain's Commonwealth inheritance, the lives of Black and Asian subjects or citizens in Britain today. These are much more affected by things like the criminal justice system, the immigration regime, the nature of labour laws, and so on. These are much more important for people's everyday lives. Why do people end up focusing on statues? Statues are, of course, symbolic, right? They're big statement pieces, and so they're easier to engage with. And it's much more difficult to make that structural change, which requires huge machineries to shift, attitudes to shift, resources to be redistributed, different kinds of ways of thinking, and so on. But I do think that talking about statues gives us an opportunity to try and reimagine what the landscape would look like if, for example, we took the history of Atlantic slavery seriously. Like, what kind of society would we live in? And what kinds of practices would we engage in? How would we remember it? So yes, I'm not personally one who's very invested in statues per se. I think it's important to say, though, that lots of the campaigners, so around Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Oxford, the campaigns were very clear that it wasn't really about the statue. The statue was a sort of flashpoint, but it was really about the experiences of minoritized and international students. It was really about the narrowness of the curriculum. It was really about the ways in which the university dealt with incidents of racism. And the fact that there was a sort of a figure there who had profited greatly from the enslavement and dispossession of African people was the sort of embodiment of all of those things.
Thank you. Tom, your view on that, and that particularly that thing about the sort of the statue representing a bad thing in the past versus actually bad things happening now. Where do you stand on that?
Well, Walter Benjamin said something to the effect of, and I haven't got the quote directly to hand, that every monument of civilization is simultaneously a monument to barbarism. And if you think of all the most famous monuments in the world, the Colosseum or the Parthenon or the pyramids or the Great Wall of China, Taj Mahal, they are all raised by people who would, I think, fail the moral standards of today. And so when we look at monuments, memorials, statues from the past, we are looking at the record of what made the present. And so they, in that sense, are parallel, to say, to the different periods of architectural style that we have, say, in a city like London. So to get rid of statues to that extent is to erase a record of what people thought at given points, at given times in the past. And I personally would regret that, because I think that it would diminish the interest and the fascination of the built environment. Now, having said that, I do think that where you have something that everyone universally in the country would condemn, the slave trade being the most obvious example, it seems unconscionable that there should be monuments to anyone who is engaged in that. But having said that, I would qualify it by saying that I think that the problem with the Colston statue, and it's been mentioned already, is that it was put up in the late 19th century at a time when everyone in the country accepted that slavery was an iniquity. A slightly different example is Thomas Guy, whose statue stands in front of the forecourt of the hospital that is named after him. Now, he's on a kind of hit list because he made some of his money by investing in I think the South Sea Company, which in turn invested in the slave business. Does that qualify his statue as fit to come down? I think not, partly for the reason that you say, that it is the nature of capitalism, it is the nature of investment, that people will invest in products that may well be embroiled in all kinds of monstrosities. So people taking photographs of the toppling of the Colston statue were doing it often on iPhones, which have just a report has just come out saying that Apple is implicit in exploiting the Uyghurs in China. Also, I think Guy's statue was put up by public subscription, and I think that it takes a certain moral arrogance to sit in judgment on people who felt sufficiently moved by Guy's contribution to public health back in the early 18th century, and to say that they were wrong to do that. And finally, Guy is being celebrated not for his record as an investor. He's not being celebrated as a successful capitalist. He's being celebrated as the man who founded a hospital and therefore stands at the fountainhead of the tradition of public health that we all celebrate today. So for those reasons, I would look on his statue, for instance, as being qualitatively different to that of Colston's.
Thank you. I'm just looking now at our audience questions, where we've got obviously quite a lot of questions which relate actually to the same kind of theme, which is the subject of our discussion, which is particularly around how you can take an objective view of the British Empire and how you can somehow find a way that everybody can agree in the way that you choose to memorialise it. Can I ask, this is a tricky one, would you suggest with these statues, building on the point that Thomas made, that they should be taken down and put somewhere else so that you can still tell that story, but it's told in a different context? Mira, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think recontextualizing is clearly what we're doing here. I think the question around the Thomas Guy statue is really interesting. Actually, my sister works in that hospital and has been there through COVID and so on. And many of her colleagues are migrant workers on insecure contracts. Many of whom have contracted COVID and their families have gotten ill. And there have been many deaths, as we know, amongst care home workers and so on. So the question is, in the hospital context, who are we celebrating and how? There's a big statue to Thomas Guy, that's great. But are there statues to the migrant nurses that came at the invitation of the government in the 1950s and, and served even under very racist conditions where they were subject to harassment, discrimination in housing, often violence? These kinds of questions, I think, are clearly important. So personally, what I would like to see are a recontextualization of how we organize our public spaces. And yeah, it's not about tearing things down and it's not about erasing the past at all. In fact, statues are there often to whitewash a legacy and as are philanthropic donations, as we know, even in the contemporary age. But being able to represent multiple sides of a past, of a history, and also who makes the country work or who makes institutions work. And it's often those people at the bottom that are effaced by the statue culture and the statues themselves.
So, but Patrick, statues tell the story, don't they? And museums tell the story, be that good or bad. So if you don't have those objects either in museums or in parks or on the curriculum, is there a risk that the story just gets forgotten?
I don't think statues tell the whole story, and that's part of the problem. There are other, I mean, if you remove statues of even of the slave traders, they're still reflected in the curriculum, they're still reflected in other aspects of the narrative of Britain. So statues is only one element of that. I mean, I've been involved in a campaign with a good friend of mine, Zahir Zadi, about when the Bank of England were considering £50 notes about a year ago. And we were campaigning to have a woman of colour on the £50 note. I was campaigning for Mary Seacole, and she was campaigning for New Khan, both women who served in conflicts, exemplary records, but not being properly recognised in British history. But Bank of England at the time were made all kinds of excuses why they wanted to consider that. I mean, great that they chose Alan Turning in the end. And we made the case that the Bank of England, 3 of the governors of Bank of England were slave traders, so at least consider BME representation. They ignored it, and then ironically, when Black Lives Matter came along, they issued a statement now acknowledging that governors were linked to the slave trade. So where were they a year ago? And that's part of the problem. It's not about statues, it's about the whole representation. And I'm more interested in having new memorials and new recognition. As Mira has said, I mean, for example, it's just only recently that Mary Seacole has been recognised for COVID rehab hospital, but that was only a result of me and others campaigning NHS England Department of Health because they wanted to name all hospitals after Florence Nightingale. There's a project that's been going for 15 years called Memorial 2007. They've got a plot of land in Hyde Park. We don't have a memorial, believe it or not. We've got loads of memorials around slave traders, but there is no memorial in Britain recognising the victims of the transatlantic slave trade. So and yet the government has not even put a hand in their pocket to support that. And it gives the impression that certain atrocities are more valued than others. And I think the Imperial Memorial Museum, the work that you do around the Holocaust is fantastic. It's internationally recognised. We need the equivalent of that, recognising the transatlantic slave trade and the horrors. We have the museum in Liverpool, and you've got the Museum of Dockland, you've got Maritime Museum, but we haven't got a focus around from our story, which is important. And also, I'm involved in another campaign around the Empire Windrush ship, which is at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea, to get the anchors of the ship to celebrate migration in Britain. So I rather spend my energies to raise money and to help to recontextualise the history, the narrative of Britain, because, as I said before, it's a cross between East Enders. Actually, I should have said Downton Abbey, actually, not Brian Hes. That was about 20 years ago, wasn't it? Downton Abbey's more recent. So it's still the same thing. What has changed?
Thank you, Patrick. So we've only got 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask each of you to suggest a statue or a museum exhibit or a something cultural that you would put up or create to memorialise the year we've just had. Mira, you can go first.
Do we want to remember the year we've just had? I'm not wholly sure. I mean, I think we do need to remember lots of things. I think the sacrifices that many made, ordinary people, in doing their jobs, in delivering food and that sort of thing. I think the delivery driver has to be the sort of iconic person of the year, the person that's kept the country running. If we want to have a figure. Let it not be a named person, but a role or somebody that without whom we can function. But in general, I would be in favour of memorials that allow us to do what I would call slow thinking rather than fast thinking. So rather than just a snapshot, have some text, have some opposing views, have multiple figures.
Tom? How would you memorialise 2020?
I would not want to memorialise it at all. We don't have memorials to the Black Death or the Great Plague of London. I think we will all want to forget it. But I would just, in a way, threading back to the previous discussion, I think that it's absolutely essential that if we view statues as part of the record of this country's past, and we're not going to get rid of them all, then this generation, our age, should be putting up statues that will serve as memorials for future generations to look at. And I completely support Patrick's campaign, Zara Zaidi's campaign, to put up statues that reflect the way that Britain is now. So just as we have Thomas Guy at Guy's, I think it's wonderful that we have Martin Jennings' statue of Mary Seacole, that I know Patrick's very much involved with, at St Thomas's, because there you have an image, because that image is not just about Mary Seacole. It's not just memorializing what she did in the Crimea. It's memorializing our understanding of what health workers now are about and what they're doing for us. We're not just commemorating the soldiers in the Crimea. We're commemorating all the people who are being treated in St Thomas's now, among them, of course, including the Prime Minister. And I think that people actually, when they look back at, say, in 100 years' time, I think that the memory will be blurred. And I think that Mary Seacole and the memory of 2020 will blur. And that statue will serve as a memorial to what happened in the NHS at this period. even though it was put up kind of 2 or 3 years before.
Thank you. Patrick, you've got the last word.
Yes, I think I've already alluded to some of the memorials I'm supporting, but there's one back this year. As you know, I've been heavily involved in the Windrush scandal for the last few years. A close friend of mine died quite recently, Paulette Wilson, aged 64 years old, a victim of the Windrush scandal. Her funeral's going to be taking place in the next few weeks, and we've raised money for funeral costs, but also we're trying to raise additional money for a memorial for her fighting the hostile environment and the Windrush scandal. And in Britain, we only have one named statue of a black woman, Mary Seacole. One. We've got more statues about cats and dogs than black women. So it'd be fantastic in Wolverhampton to have a memorial recognising Paulette Wilson, Windrush campaigner, fighter, and to me that's important as well. So as we look back and we say to ourselves, this will never happen again, but probably will do. But let's try and work towards that.
Thank you, Patrick. So thank you, a huge thank you to the three of you. We've had a really good go at covering an enormous topic in a very short space of time. And I'd like to thank all of you for your really thoughtful contributions. I've learned a lot, and I hope our audience has too. Next month, we're doing one of these on propaganda and social media disinformation in a time of crisis. That will be on Thursday, the 17th of September at 4:30 p.m. And I would like to just remind you all that the museum is now open again. It's a charity. It relies very much on your engagement, on your donations, on your membership. So please join us, come and see us, help us out where you can, and engage with us. And in particular, in light of the conversation we've just had, if you've got a story that relates to our museum's remit that you don't feel has been told, engage with us and make sure that people are telling it. Thank you very much for your time.